Wanjiru's worn sandals snapped just as the tall glass doors of Caribou Holdings swung open. The laughter started before she could even steady herself. Who let this street girl inside? Moses barked across the marble lobby loud enough for every receptionist, guard, and client to hear. This is a corporate headquarters, not a shelter. A few employees smirked. One guard stepped toward her. Wanjiru lowered her eyes, clutching her faded bag against her chest. Then Moses grabbed the bag, flung it onto the polished floor, and scattered its contents across the lobby. A phone, a notebook, a cheap scarf, and one black access card. The room fell silent, because printed across it were 4 words that turned every face white: Chief Executive Officer. Wanjiru Njoroge. Before we go on, tell me honestly, if you saw someone being humiliated in public because they looked poor, would you step in or stay silent and protect yourselves? And where are you watching from today? Drop your country and local time in the comments. If you enjoy emotional, dramatic stories filled with shocking twists, justice, and powerful life lessons, subscribe and stay with me for the rest of this story. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the lobby moved. The polished marble floor still reflected the scattered contents of Wanjiru's torn bag. Her cheap scarf lay near the reception desk. Her cracked phone had spun in a slow circle before stopping beside Moses's shining shoe. And in the center of it all, the black access card rested face up like a blade. Chief Executive Officer, Wanjiru Njoroge. Moses stared at it first with irritation, then confusion, then naked fear. He bent quickly, almost desperately, and snatched the card off the floor, as if the words might change in his hand. They did not. His face drained of color. Around him, the employees who had laughed only seconds earlier suddenly looked as though the air had vanished from the room. The receptionist Zawadi covered her mouth. One of the guards took a step back. A client near the elevators slowly lowered his phone, no longer pretending to scroll. Even the quiet hum of the lobby seemed to shrink away, swallowed by the enormous silence. Wanjiru did not rush to explain. She did not raise her voice. She crouched calmly and picked up her notebook from the floor, dusting it with care. Then she lifted her broken sandal and set it beside her bag. Her movements were steady, almost gentle, but that gentleness made the scene far more terrifying. It was the calm of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Moses's lips trembled around the word. There must be some misunderstanding. Wanjiru rose slowly to her feet. For the first time, she looked directly at him. There was no anger in her face. That would have been easier for him. Anger could be negotiated with. Anger burned and passed. What stared back at him now was far worse. Disappointment. Measured. Silent. Final. Is there? She asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire lobby. Moses swallowed hard. I did not know who you were. A flicker crossed Wanjiru's eyes. That, she said, is exactly the problem. The elevator doors at the far end of the lobby opened with a soft chime. 6 people stepped out at once, members of the senior executive team, department heads, and the chairman of the board. They had the tense, alert expressions of people who had rushed down after receiving an urgent message. At the front was Mr. Patel, the company's legal advisor, still clutching a folder to his chest. The moment they saw Wanjiru standing beside the scattered contents of her bag, their faces tightened. Then they saw Moses. Then they saw the card in his hand. No one needed an explanation. Mr. Patel moved first. Madam CEO, he said, his voice controlled but sharp, we came down as soon as we were informed. Informed. The word struck the room like another slap. It meant someone had already alerted upper management. It meant what happened here had been seen. It meant this was no private misunderstanding that Moses could smooth over with excuses and charm. Wanjiru nodded once, but did not take her eyes off him. Moses Odiambo, she said. At the sound of his full name, his knees nearly gave way. "Yes, madam." "Did you ask who I was before you insulted me?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. "No, madam." "Did you ask why I was here?" "No, madam." "Did you allow me to speak for more than 5 seconds before deciding my worth?" His breathing grew louder. "No, madam." Wanjiru tilted her head slightly as though she were studying not just his answer, but the long habit buried inside it. "And if I had not been the CEO," she asked, "what would have happened to me?" This time he did not answer at all, because everyone in the lobby already knew. If the card had not fallen, if the title had remained hidden, if the woman in the worn dress had simply been another poor stranger, he would have thrown her out, he would have laughed, and everyone else would have gone back to work. Wanjiru turned away from him at last and faced the room. There were perhaps 40 people in the lobby now. Reception staff assistants, security visitors, junior analysts waiting for the morning briefing. Not one of them could look at her for long. When I walked through those doors, she said I was not greeted. I was measured. Her gaze swept the room. Measured by my shoes, my bag, my clothes, my silence. No one moved. Some of you laughed. Some of you watched. Some of you chose comfort over courage. Zawadi's eyes filled with tears. The older guard near the entrance lowered his head in shame. Wanjiru saw all of it. She stored every expression away. Then she extended her hand toward Moses. "My card." He rushed forward to return it, but his fingers shook so badly that he nearly dropped it again. Wanjiru took it without thanks and slipped it into the inside pocket of her faded cardigan. Then she faced Mr. Patel. Effective immediately, she said, "Moses Odhiambo is suspended from duty, pending full disciplinary review." The words landed with surgical precision. Moses gasped. "Madam, please." She continued, as if he had not spoken. "Disable his building access. Revoke his entry to all internal systems. Email finance records, procurement platforms, and staff files." Mr. Patel nodded quickly. "At once." "No!" Moses burst out, stepping forward. "Madam, please, you cannot do this in the lobby in front of everyone. At least let us speak privately." That was the first real emotion in Wanjiru's face. Not pity. Cold clarity. "You humiliated me publicly," she said. "Why should accountability hide in private?" A murmur rippled through the staff. Moses's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Wanjiru took one step closer. "You were not cruel because you were confused," she said. "You were cruel because you felt safe. You believed the person in front of you had no power, no title, no one who would defend her. That is the only reason men like you show their true character." Each sentence struck harder than a shout. Moses's shoulders bent inward, but Wanjiru was not finished. "This was not an unfortunate mistake," she said. "It was a revelation." From the corner of her eye, she saw one of the IT officers already typing furiously into a tablet. Somewhere above them, security systems were being updated. Doors were closing. Permissions were disappearing. Moses was losing pieces of his kingdom, one click at a time. The sound seemed to reach him too. His arrogance collapsed into panic. "Madame C. Oh, I have served this company for 8 years," he said, voice breaking. "I have results. I have numbers. I have led teams. Ask anyone. I made a bad judgment for one moment, but that should not erase everything." "One moment," Wanjiru repeated softly. She turned to the nearest guard. "How many times have you seen visitors treated this way?" The guard hesitated. His throat moved. Then very quietly he said, "Too many times, madam." Wanjiru looked at Zawadi. The receptionist's hands trembled on the desk. "It happens often," she whispered. "Mostly to job seekers, delivery workers, support staff. Anyone who looks poor." The last word nearly broke her. Wanjiru nodded once. Then she looked back at Moses. So no, she said. This was not one moment. His eyes widened. Something new entered the air, then not just shame, but dread. Because for the first time, the room understood this was bigger than a manager insulting the wrong woman. Wanjiru had not arrived unexpectedly. She had arrived and observed. She had come wearing simplicity like a mirror, and what the company reflected back had been ugly. She turned toward the senior staff. "Let me be very clear," she said. "What happened here today is not a public relations concern. It is not a training issue. It is not a misunderstanding caused by stress." Her voice sharpened. "It is a culture problem." No one breathed. "I have spent the past several weeks reviewing reports that claim this company values dignity, fairness, and human worth at every level. This morning those claims were tested at the front door." She let the words settle. "And this company failed." The lobby seemed smaller now, as though the walls themselves were listening. Mr. Patel cleared his throat. "Madam CEO, would you like us to prepare an internal statement?" "Yes," Wanjiru said, "and an external one if necessary. But first I want a full audit of visitor treatment logs, security complaints, HR dismissals involving support staff, and all disciplinary incidents linked to Moses Odhiambo's department." Moses's head jerked up at once. There it was. Not grief, not remorse. Fear, Wanjiru noticed. So did Mr. Patel. A tiny silence opened between them, sharp as a pin. Interesting. Wanjiru filed that reaction away without changing expression. Because suddenly this was no longer just about insult. The terror in Moses's face had gone deeper than losing his job. It looked like the fear of a man who knew one pulled thread might unravel an entire hidden fabric. Very softly, Wanjiru said, "Search everything." Then she lifted her torn bag from the floor, broken sandal in one hand, dignity untouched. "Welcome to the real beginning," she said. And for the first time since entering the building, the people in that lobby understood that the woman they had mistaken for powerless had not merely exposed one bully. She had opened a door, and behind it, something much darker was waiting. 3 weeks earlier, before the broken sandal, before the black access card, before Moses's face turned the color of ash in the lobby, Wanjiru Njoroge had sat alone in her father's office and stared at a company that did not feel honest. From the outside, Karibu Holdings looked untouchable. Its headquarters in Nairobi rose in glass and steel above the city like a declaration of power. Business magazines praised its growth. International partners called it one of East Africa's most disciplined corporate success stories. Its annual reports glowed with phrases like integrity, innovation, people-first leadership, and community transformation. The numbers were even better. Revenue was up. Operating costs were controlled. Employee retention appeared stable. Internal satisfaction surveys were almost suspiciously positive. Too positive. That was what bothered Wanjiru. She sat behind the enormous desk that had once belonged to her father, Daniel Njoroge, and studied the stack of reports laid out before her. The air conditioning hummed softly. The city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows flickered across the glass like distant code. Everything in that office was built to communicate certainty. The dark wood shelves, the awards, the framed photos of handshakes, ribbon cuttings, board dinners, smiling executives. Even grief in that room had structure. But Wanjiru had never trusted polished surfaces. Not completely. Not after the life she had seen. Mr. Patel, the legal advisor, stood near the edge of the room that night with a folder tucked under his arm. "Your father believed in evidence," he had said carefully. "If there is something troubling you, Madam CEO, we can commission a standard review." Wanjiru did not answer at once. She picked up the latest staff culture report instead. The paper was smooth and expensive. The chart on page 4 showed 93% employee trust in leadership. Another showed overwhelming confidence in grievance channels. Another claimed that all visitors and junior workers were treated with equal respect under a revised dignity framework introduced 2 years earlier. 93%. Equal respect, dignity framework. Beautiful words, dead words perhaps. She set the report down. "Do you believe this?" she asked. Mr. Patel hesitated. It was not the hesitation of a liar. It was the hesitation of a cautious man who had survived many years inside powerful rooms by speaking only when he could stand firmly on solid ground. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the report reflects what was submitted." Wanjiru looked up. That answer told her more than a direct accusation would have. Not what was true, what was submitted. A small silence stretched between them. "My father trusted too many polished summaries," she said at last. Mr. Patel lowered his eyes. "Your father trusted systems he thought he had built well." Wanjiru turned her chair toward the window. There was tenderness in her grief, but not blindness. Her father had been respected, feared, admired, even loved in certain circles. He had come from almost nothing and built Caribou Holdings into a regional force. Newspapers called him visionary. Rivals called him ruthless. Employees called him distant. To Wanjiru he had been more complicated than all of those words. He had not been warm, but he had been deliberate. Not expressive, but often watchful. He had loved through structure, through provision, through strategy. He had prepared her for power before he had ever prepared her for mourning. And yet the last year of his life had changed him. After his second stroke, when his body weakened and his speech slowed, he had begun asking strange questions. Not about quarterly targets or debt exposure, about cleaners, about drivers, about who was being dismissed quietly, about why small complaints vanished before they reached his desk. At the time, Wanjiru thought grief and illness had simply made him more reflective. Now, seated in his office after the funeral, surrounded by reports that looked too perfect, she wondered whether he had seen rot spreading beneath the polished floors long before anyone else admitted it. Was he investigating something before he died? She asked. Mr. Patel's jaw tightened by the smallest degree. He had concerns, he said. What kind of concerns? He did not leave a formal accusation. That is not what I asked. Mr. Patel inhaled. At the end, he said, choosing each word with care, your father became increasingly dissatisfied with how information reached him. He believed middle management had become skilled at filtering reality. Wanjiru gave a quiet, humorless laugh. Filtering reality, she repeated. That is a gentle phrase for corruption. Not all distortion is financial. Patel replied. No, Wanjiru said. Sometimes it is moral. That sentence stayed in the room a long time. The truth was, Wanjiru did not need reports to understand what polished people could hide. She had learned that lesson much earlier, long before she ever wore tailored suits or entered boardrooms. When she was 8 years old, she had stood outside a pharmacy with her mother, Mama Njeri, and watched 2 well-dressed women wrinkle their noses because Njeri's shoes were dusty. Wanjiru remembered every detail of that afternoon with brutal clarity. The dry heat, the ache in her stomach, her mother counting coins twice before entering the shop, the women glancing at them, then at each other, then smiling with that soft cruelty the rich often believed did not count because it was elegant. At 10, Wanjiru had learned that embarrassment could be silent. At 12, she had learned that silence could harden into fuel. Her mother never forgot respect. That was the strange thing. Poverty did not make Mama Njeri bitter. It made her observant. She taught Wanjiru to watch how people behaved when there was nothing to gain, how they spoke to waiters, how they looked at guards, whether their kindness traveled downward or only upward. Character, her mother used to say while braiding her hair in their small kitchen, shows itself fastest when someone thinks you do not matter. Wanjiru never forgot that either. By 19, she was studying finance abroad, then management, then corporate law. By 26, she could read balance sheets, acquisition structures, labor costs, and legal exposure faster than most men twice her age. By 30, her father had quietly begun bringing her into private strategy meetings. Many board members assumed she was there to learn. They did not know she was already there to notice what others missed. And what Wanjiru missed least of all was false perfection. Over the following days, she immersed herself in Caribou Holdings with the discipline of a surgeon. She reviewed procurement patterns. She read grievance archives. She compared termination histories across departments. She flagged complaints that had disappeared without resolution and traced approval chains that made no sense. Again and again, a pattern emerged. The uglier the allegation, the cleaner the paperwork around it. Missing complaint records. Identical phrasing in supposedly independent incident summaries. Dismissals marked voluntary despite contradictory timing. Visitor complaints logged without names. Support staff rotations with suspicious frequency. It was not enough to prove a criminal network, but it was enough to tell her one thing with certainty. Someone inside the company had become expert at burying discomfort before it could turn into consequence. Late one evening, she took a folder home and found her mother awake at the dining table mending the hem of an old dress under a yellow lamp. Wanjiru looked up the moment Wanjiru entered. "You have your father's storm face," she said quietly. Wanjiru smiled despite herself. "Storm face, the one that says you have seen something ugly and are deciding whether to break it." Wanjiru set the folder down and sank into the chair across from her. "What if the company is lying to itself?" she asked. Her mother threaded the needle again. "Companies do not lie to themselves," she said. "People do." That answer settled over Wanjiru like truth always did, simple, unsentimental, impossible to ignore. She leaned back and watched her mother's hands. Hands that had washed, carried, scrubbed, mended, survived. Hands that never looked weak to her, no matter how life had worn them. "If I rely only on reports," Wanjiru said, "I will see only what they want me to see." Wanjiru nodded. "Then stop looking from above." Wanjiru frowned slightly. Her mother lifted her eyes. "Go where they think you are too important to go." The room became very still. There it was. Not a strategy deck. Not a consulting recommendation. Not a board-approved review. A harder truth. Power, if it wanted honesty, had to walk unprotected into places where titles meant nothing. That night, Wanjiru barely slept. By dawn, the plan had already begun forming with terrifying clarity. She would not announce surprise inspections. She would not send memos. She would not rely on department heads to monitor themselves. She would not arrive with assistants, cameras, or polished escorts that made everyone perform virtue. She would disappear, or rather she would become the kind of person invisible to people like Moses long before she ever met him. Over the next week, only 3 people knew the full plan: Wanjiru, Mr. Patel, and a discreet IT security officer named Ao, who had been loyal to her father for years. Together, they designed a controlled, covert review. Limited camera access, private observation logs, restricted movement records, anonymous complaint retrieval, temporary identity masking within visitor systems. Nothing illegal, nothing theatrical, just enough structure to let truth breathe on its own. Wanjiru selected plain clothes from local markets herself: a faded skirt, a cardigan with loose threading, flat sandals already worn at the heel, a second-hand bag. No jewelry except tiny earrings easy to miss. No makeup beyond what could dull her skin instead of highlight it. No perfume. No executive sharpness in posture. Even her speech changed. Softer, less clipped, less boardroom, more ordinary. When she first saw herself in the mirror after the transformation, she felt something cold move through her chest. Not because she looked poor, because she looked familiar. She looked like a road her life could easily have remained on if different hands had not intervened, if different silences had not shaped her future. Mr. Patel met her at a private side entrance on the morning of the first test site visit. He looked deeply uncomfortable. "This is unorthodox," he said. "Yes," Wanjiru replied. "It could backfire. Yes, you may be insulted." She met his gaze without blinking. "That she said is the point." Then she took the visitor pass under a false general label, adjusted the strap of her worn bag, and walked toward the company that believed it knew itself. Behind the polished mission statements, behind the public awards, behind the smiling photographs and neat reports, Wanjiru was no longer entering as a CEO. She was entering as a question, and somewhere inside Karibu Holdings, hidden beneath layers of performance and fear, the real answer was waiting for her. By noon, the entire headquarters had changed temperature. Not literally. The air conditioning still whispered through the vents, the elevators still opened with soft electronic chimes, and the polished floors still reflected the movement of expensive shoes. But beneath that polished order, something had shifted. Employees walked more carefully. Conversations stopped when certain doors opened. Assistants carried files with tighter hands. People who normally floated through the corridors with lazy confidence suddenly kept their heads down, as if the building itself had grown ears. Wanjiru noticed all of it. She had expected panic after Moses' suspension. What she had not expected was the speed with which fear began moving through the company like a live current. That meant one of two things. Either Moses was more deeply connected than his title suggested, or everyone had already sensed something rotten beneath the surface and was terrified that the new CEO had finally smelled it too. Possibly both. She spent the afternoon in the executive boardroom not to rest, but to observe. The room was large, chilled, and designed to intimidate. A long walnut table stretched beneath pendant lights. Framed maps of regional operations lined the walls. At the far end, Nairobi glowed beyond the glass like a city pretending not to watch. Mr. Patel sat to her right with a legal pad. Io from IT sat farther down, working silently with two secured laptops. On the wall screen, internal access records flickered in clean lines and timestamps. Moses Odiambo's permissions had been cut off at 10:18 a.m. At 10:23 a.m., he had tried to re-enter the finance portal using an old administrative path. At 10:26 a.m., he had attempted access through a procurement mirror account. At 10:31 a.m., he had called 3 internal extensions in under 90 seconds. At 10:36 a.m., after being escorted out of the building, he had made 4 consecutive external calls from the parking area. The fourth number held Wanjiru's attention. It was not saved in the open employee directory. It was a direct executive line. Io looked up from the screen. "The last number belongs to Mr. Kamau's office." The room became still. Mr. Kamau, head of operations, trusted veteran of the old regime, the man board members praised whenever they wanted to sound practical, the man who knew every warehouse, every regional manager, every supply chain bottleneck, every unglamorous engine that kept profit moving. Unlike the flashier executives, Kamau did not chase attention. He had built a reputation on efficiency, discretion, and results. People described him with dangerous words: dependable, seasoned, essential. Men like that were rarely clean if corruption had matured inside a company. Not always, but often enough. Wanjiru leaned back slightly. How long after losing access did he call Kamau? 18 minutes, Io said, and Kamau returned the call. Io checked. Yes. 2 minutes later. Duration 6 minutes 43 seconds. Wanjiru's eyes narrowed. A frightened manager calling a senior executive after public suspension could mean many things. Panic, loyalty, desperation. But the length of the call suggested more than emotional support. It suggested strategy. Mr. Patel folded his hands. "Do you want to summon Kamau now?" "No," Wanjiru said. "Why not?" Because if Moses is only a symptom, I do not want the disease warned too early. That answer settled heavily over the table. Wanjiru rose and crossed to the window. Below, traffic moved in glittering threads around the base of the tower. Tiny people crossed streets carrying lunch children tools, plastic bags, burdens. From this height, everyone looked equal. That was the lie height always told. Search Moses's department first, she said. Visitor complaints, procurement, approvals, disciplinary patterns, reimbursement, anomalies, informal vendor disputes, anything buried or downgraded. Ayo nodded and began working. The first layer came quickly. 3 dismissed janitors over 14 months, all marked for conduct instability, all terminated within days of filing internal discomfort reports. 2 contract security officers rotated out suddenly after requesting transfer away from Moses's floor. 1 receptionist resignation logged as family reasons, despite emails indicating escalating harassment complaints. A procurement assistant transferred to Kisumu after challenging a payment adjustment she did not authorize. On paper, each event stood alone. Together they formed a shape. Wanjiru turned back toward the screen, reading silently, slowly. She had trained herself never to rush ugly truths. People skimmed what they feared. She did the opposite. She looked harder. Pull salary deductions, she said, especially support staff. Ayo complied. A new set of records appeared. Uniform penalties, facility damage fees, lateness deductions, meal voucher reversals, cash adjustments so small that no board member would ever notice them, but regular enough to wound people living paycheck to paycheck. Wanjiru felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was not careless administration. This was predation scaled to invisibility. Take a little from the powerful, and there would be an audit. Take a little from the poor, and there would be silence. Mr. Patel exhaled slowly. This could still be Moses abusing a weak department. Could be, Wanjiru said. But then she saw the approval chain. Every 3rd or 4th anomaly, every larger vendor override, every grievance marked non-actionable after escalating traced upward through a common sign-off path. Operations. Kamau. Sometimes directly, sometimes through deputies he controlled. Wanjiru stared at this pattern long enough for anger to rise, then forced herself to cool it down. Anger made people feel righteous. She needed sharper than righteous. She needed exact. At 3:40 p.m., a discreet knock came at the door. Mr. Patel opened it just enough to exchange a few words with an assistant. When he turned back, his expression had changed. "Kamau is here," he said. "He says he heard about the incident and wants to offer support." "Support?" Wanjiru almost smiled. "Let him in." Mr. Kamau entered with the smooth composure of a man who had spent years training his face never to arrive before his intentions. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal suit that carried authority without showing off. His eyes moved quickly once across the room, taking in Patel Ayo, the screen's Wanjiru by the window. Then he arranged concern across his features like a careful host setting a table. "Madame CEO," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I came as soon as I learned what happened downstairs. Unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable." Wanjiru shook his hand once. His palm was dry. Not nervous then, or not visibly so. "Please," she said, gesturing toward a chair. "Sit." He did. I must say Kamau continued. "What Moses did was shameful. We have standards here. That kind of behavior cannot be tolerated. I hope you know you have my full support in handling it decisively." Wanjiru sat opposite him. "How long have you known Moses?" she asked. Kamau did not blink. "About 6 years professionally, perhaps a little longer in passing. And your assessment of his character?" A faint pause, just enough to notice if one knew how. Capable Kamau said, ambitious, at times overly forceful. I would not have predicted this level of recklessness. Not this level. Interesting phrasing. As if other levels had existed. Wanjiru folded her hands on the table. He called you this morning. I assume he did, Kamau replied. I missed several calls during a site briefing. You returned one. Another small pause. Yes. What did he want? Kamau's expression turned gently regretful. He was distressed. Claimed there had been confusion in the lobby and that he had offended an important visitor without realizing the full context. Important visitor. Not CEO. Not you. A careful lie, then. Or a careful partial truth. Wanjiru let the silence stretch. Kamau shifted only slightly. It was the first visible sign that her quiet was forcing him to work harder than he liked. And what did you advise, she asked. That he remain calm. Cooperate. Trust the process. Trust the process. The phrase landed with the polished emptiness of executive language meant to soothe without revealing. Io kept his eyes on the laptop, but Wanjiru saw his fingers still. Everyone in the room understood now Kamau was not here merely to check on her. He was here to measure what she knew. Good. Let him measure. Wanjiru rose and walked to the screen, studying the grievance summaries displayed there. Mr. Kamau, she said, without turning. How often do support staff formally complain in this company? He took a second too long. Not often, he said. We have worked hard to create stable channels. She faced him. Or efficient burial grounds. Patel glanced down immediately. Kamau gave a surprised laugh that did not reach his eyes. I beg your pardon. Wanjiru stepped closer to the table. 3 janitors dismissed after complaint filings. A receptionist resignation under suspicious pressure. Salary deductions against low-wage staff with inconsistent authorization. Procurement irregularities linked to Moses's line of influence. Do these look like isolated management-style issues to you? Kamau's face remained composed, but his shoulders had lost 1 degree of ease. I would caution against drawing conclusions from incomplete data, he said. Would you? Yes. Patterns can be misleading without context. Wanjiru nodded slowly. Then help me with the context. Kamau leaned back, the picture of reluctant professionalism. Operations at scale are messy. Support staff records are not always pristine. Supervisors make judgment calls. Terminations happen. Errors happen. We should be careful not to transform an ugly incident into a witch hunt. There it was. Not denial. Reframing. Minimize the moral issue. Emphasize administrative complexity. Warn against overreaction. Classic containment language. Wanjiru's voice cooled. Do you know what I think transforms misconduct into a system? Kamau said nothing. Repetition, she answered. Protection. And the confidence that no one above will look too closely. For the first time, something harder moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. Calculation. Madame CEO, he said, his tone lowering. You have inherited this company at a vulnerable time. There are investors watching. Regional negotiations underway. Competitors would love to see instability framed as moral collapse. I say this with respect. The difference between strong leadership and destructive leadership is sometimes restraint. Wanjiru held his gaze, and in that instant she saw him clearly. This man did not believe cruelty was wrong. He believed exposure was inconvenient. That told her everything. She walked back to her chair and sat. Thank you, she said. Kamau blinked once. For what? For showing me exactly how this company learned to speak while hiding its teeth. Io looked up sharply. Patel's pen stopped moving. Kamau's polite mask tightened by almost nothing but enough. Wanjiru leaned forward. Do not mistake my silence for uncertainty, she said. And do not mistake your years in this building for immunity. The air in the room changed. Kamau rose more slowly than he had sat down. "If that is an accusation," he said, "I suggest you make it formally." "Oh, I will," Wanjiru replied. "When I have all of it." He stared at her for a long second, then adjusted his cuff. "Then I hope for the company's sake that your search is thorough." "It will be." He gave one stiff nod and walked to the door. Just before leaving, he glanced once at the screen. Not at the visitor complaints, not at the dismissals, at the procurement logs. Then he left. The door clicked shut behind him. Nobody spoke for 3 seconds. Then Wanjiru said very softly, "He is afraid of the money trail." Io was already typing. "I saw it too." Mr. Patel looked toward the closed door, troubled. If Kamau is involved, this is bigger than internal cruelty. Wanjiru's face hardened. "Yes," she said. "Cruelty is just how they practiced power." She looked at the screen again, at the scattered records, the tiny penalties, the vanishing complaints, the frightened calls. Moses was not the storm. He was debris blown ahead of it. And somewhere beneath the company's clean reports and polished speeches, a darker structure was beginning to show its outline. That evening, Nairobi wore the soft gold of a city trying to look gentle before night fully claimed it. Wanjiru left the headquarters long after most of the executives had gone home. The lobby that had humiliated her in the morning now stood too quiet, too polished, as if the building itself wanted to erase what had happened there. Security staff straightened when she passed. Receptionists avoided her eyes. A few junior employees looked as though they wanted to speak, apologize, confess, or beg, but fear still held their tongues. Wanjiru did not stop. She stepped into the back seat of the waiting car and gave only one instruction. "Take me to my mother." The driver nodded and pulled into the evening traffic. As the city light stretched across the windshield, Wanjiru leaned her head back and closed her eyes, but rest would not come. Moses's face kept returning to her. Not his cruelty, that part was ordinary in the saddest way. She had seen men like him all her life. Men who believed kindness was a luxury reserved for equals. Men who mistook poverty for worthlessness. Men who spoke of professionalism while using power like a whip. No, what stayed with her was the fear that crossed his face when Kamau's name entered the room. Not shame. Fear. The kind of fear that belonged to someone who had not simply done wrong, but had done wrong as part of something organized. And now the road beneath that wrong was leading her somewhere much older than Moses. Somewhere personal. The car turned off the main road and entered a quieter neighborhood on the edge of the city. Here the streets narrowed. The air changed. Concrete walls gave way to simpler homes with tin roofs, painted gates. Little gardens pressed stubbornly against dust. This was not where the board imagined their CEO would go after a crisis. That thought almost made Wanjiru smile. Her mother's house stood behind a blue metal gate that had been repaired so many times it looked like resilience made visible. The porch light was on. Wanjiru was already outside before the car had fully stopped. She wore a plain wrapper skirt and a faded knitted shawl, despite the warmth. In one hand she held a basin of washed vegetables. In the other nothing at all, because women like her had learned long ago that love often meant being ready to receive pain empty-handed. When Wanjiru stepped out of the car, her mother's eyes dropped at once to the torn sandal, then to the tiredness in her face, then to the bag with the broken strap. Wanjiru set the basin down without a word. "What happened?" she asked softly. Wanjiru tried to answer calmly. She truly did. But the moment she heard her mother's voice, something inside her loosened. "They laughed," she said. It was such a simple sentence, too small for what it carried. Wanjiru came down the porch steps and took her into her arms. For a moment, Wanjiru was no CEO, no strategist, no investigator, no heir to an empire of glass and numbers. She was simply a daughter who had walked into a room wearing humility and been handed contempt. They laughed. Wanjiru said again, more quietly this time, as if saying it twice might reduce its power. Manjeri held her tighter. "Then now you know," she murmured. Wanjiru pulled back slightly. "Know what their true religion?" Wanjiru frowned. "Pride," her mother said. "That is what some people worship." Inside the house smelled of onion soap and old wood. Familiar smells. Honest smells. The kind that never needed to impress anyone. Manjeri served tea in mismatched cups and set boiled maize on a plate between them, though Wanjiru had no appetite. Still, she took a piece because refusing food from a mother like Njeri felt like refusing memory itself. For a while they sat in silence. Outside, children's voices drifted faintly from the neighboring compound. Somewhere farther away, a radio played a gospel song through static. The ordinary sound of evening wrapped around them like cloth. Finally, Wanjiru placed her cup down. "Mama," she said, "I need you to tell me everything." Manjeri did not pretend not to understand. She had always known this day might come. Perhaps she had feared it. Perhaps she had waited for it. The lamp beside the table cast warm light over the lines in her face, and Wanjiru saw what time had done. There not just age, but endurance. Quiet endurance, the hardest kind. "About the company," Wanjiru said. "About what happened to you." Manjeri lowered her eyes to her hands. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she gave a tired smile with no joy in it. "I hoped," she said, "that your life would rise so far above that place that you would never need to look back." "My life was built in its shadow," Wanjiru replied. "That was true in more ways than one." Her mother exhaled slowly. "Then listen." And so Wanjiru listened. Years earlier, before Karibu Holdings became the polished giant, it was now Manjeri had worked as a cleaning woman in one of its older administrative buildings. Not the glamorous tower, not the offices where visiting investors were taken. A less important branch where support staff entered through the back and disappeared into the machinery of other people's ambition. At the time, Wanjiru had been only 7. Her father, Daniel Nyoroge, was already important then, though not yet the untouchable figure he would later become. Their relationship had not been public. That, too, had been part of the compromise and shame woven into the early years. He provided. He visited. He promised the future would be different. But his world and Manjeri's world did not stand side by side in daylight. One rainy season, a financial discrepancy was discovered in the branch. Petty cash missing. Supply entries altered, cleaning inventory inflated. Nothing dramatic by corporate standards, but dramatic enough for someone poor to be destroyed by it. "They questioned all of us," Manjeri said, "but not equally." Wanjiru's fingers tightened around her cup. Her mother continued, voice steady in the way only long-healed wounds could manage. The managers already knew who they wanted to blame. They wanted someone with no lawyer, no title, no voice anyone would defend. Someone replaceable. Someone who entered through the service door. "You," Wanjiru said. Manjeri nodded. "I was accused of tampering with storage records," she said. "Of stealing small amounts over time. They said maybe I thought no one would notice because the amounts were too little to matter. The cruelty of it made Wanjiru's chest go hot. Too little to matter. That was how the powerful justified everything stolen from the poor, not enough for anyone important to care. What proof did they have?" she asked. "Almost none. But they had signatures I never made, and one supervisor willing to swear he had seen irregular behavior." Manjeri gave a bitter little laugh. Strange how truth becomes easy to edit when spoken by people in pressed shirts. Wanjiru stared at her mother's face. "And my father?" There was the harder question. Manjeri's silence stretched this time. When she finally spoke, every word landed heavier than the last. He knew something was wrong. Wanjiru did not breathe. "He did not believe I stole," Manjeri said. "I am certain of that. He knew my character. He knew me. But at that time, the company was negotiating a major expansion. There were lenders watching, reporters digging. Internal scandal could have weakened everything. And the people around him, her mouth tightened, kept telling him the matter was small, contained, regrettable, but manageable. Wanjiru's voice dropped, so he let them bury it. Manjeri looked at her with aching tenderness. He asked for time. That answer hurt more than denial would have. Time, the favorite refuge of men who knew the truth but feared its consequences. "What happened to you?" Wanjiru asked. "I was dismissed," her mother said simply, quietly. No public accusation because they did not want noise. No public apology either. Just a file, a rumor, a door closing. And him. For months he kept sending money through intermediaries. Then later, directly. School fees, rent, food, medical bills when you were sick. He did what powerful men often do when their conscience wakes up late. He paid toward the wound. Wanjiru looked away. The room blurred for a second, though tears never fully fell. Her grief had always been disciplined. That did not make it small. She had loved her father. That was still true. She had admired him. That was still true too. And now she had to make room for another truth, beside those truths that he had failed when courage cost too much. "Mama," she said after a while, "why didn't you tell me all of this sooner?" Her mother smiled sadly. "Because I did not want you to grow up feeding on revenge." Wanjiru swallowed hard, and because Mama Njeri added, "I knew one day you might inherit his world. If that happened, I wanted you to enter it with a clean heart first, not a poisoned one." The words nearly broke her. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Wanjiru asked the question that had been growing like iron inside her all evening. "Do you remember the names?" Mama Njeri's eyes lifted to hers. Not many people could understand the exact weight carried in that question. It was not mere curiosity. It was lineage meeting accountability. Daughter meeting system. Memory asking history whether it still thought it had escaped. "Yes," Mama Njeri said. Wanjiru leaned forward. "Tell me." Her mother began listing them slowly. A supervisor, a records clerk, a finance officer who later vanished upward into another department, and one name that made Wanjiru go completely still. Kamau. Not yet the operations chief back then, but already inside the chain, already trusted, already present when small wrongs were being arranged into official stories. He was not the loudest, Manjeri said. That is what made him dangerous. He was the one who always made the ugly thing sound administrative. Wanjiru felt a chill spread through her limbs. Of course it was him. Not a man who loved chaos. A man who loved neat cruelty. Processed cruelty, documented cruelty, the kind that entered files and came out looking reasonable. She rose from the table and walked to the small window near the sink. Outside, the dark had fully arrived. In the reflected glass, she could see herself and her mother behind her. Two women, one scarred by the system, one now standing at its center. "I thought I inherited a company," she said quietly. "No," Mama Nijiri replied. "You inherited a debt." Wanjiru closed her eyes. A debt. Not only financial, not only moral, familial, historical. The building she now ruled had once spat her mother out and called it policy. The empire her father left her had been strengthened in part by a silence that helped bury an innocent woman so investors would not panic. That changed everything. Or perhaps it clarified everything. When Wanjiru turned back, her face had changed. Some tenderness remained, but it had sharpened. Purpose had entered it more fully now, no longer as suspicion, but as inheritance accepted. "I will not protect his silence," she said. Manjeri searched her face. He was still your father. Yes, Wanjiru said. And because he was my father, I will finish what he did not have the courage to finish. Something deep and old moved through the room. Then not vengeance, but reckoning. Mum and Jerry nodded once. Not happily, but with peace. Wanjiru crossed back to the table, took her mother's hand and held it. I cannot undo what they did to you, she said, but I can make sure the walls that protected them come down. Her mother squeezed her fingers. Then do it without becoming like them. Wanjiru bowed her head once. That she understood was the real test, not whether she could punish, whether she could remain human while doing justice. Outside, the city continued breathing in the dark. Inside the little house beyond the reach of corporate towers, a daughter finally understood that her battle inside Caribou Holdings was no longer just about one cruel manager or one hidden corruption ring. It was about family, responsibility, and a truth buried years ago under paperwork, silence, and shame. Now that truth had a name, and Wanjiru had stopped looking away. The next morning, Wanjiru arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The city was still half blue with dawn, and Caribou Holdings looked different without its daytime arrogance. The glass tower no longer glittered. It loomed. Its polished exterior reflected only a pale sky and the empty road below. As if stripped of witnesses, the building had finally stopped pretending to be noble. Wanjiru preferred it this way. Truth often entered before spectacle did. Ayo was already waiting for her in the executive conference room, with 2 laptops open, a thermos of coffee untouched, and a stack of printed personnel files arranged with almost military precision. Mr. Patel joined them minutes later, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. No sleep, Wanjiru asked. Patel gave a dry smile. Not enough to improve my opinion of this company. Good, she said. Then we are aligned. She set her bag down and looked over the files. Names, dates, transfers, resignations, warnings, tiny administrative scars left across the lives of people who had once tried to speak and discovered that institutions knew how to punish softly. Today, Wanjiru said, we stop reading only what management wrote. I want the people management tried to erase. Ayo nodded. I compiled a list of staff and ex-staff connected to flagged complaints, payroll irregularities, and security incidents. Some are still here, some left. A few may be willing to talk if approached carefully. Not in HR offices, Wanjiru said at once, and not with department heads anywhere nearby. Patel raised an eyebrow. You think they are still being watched? I think fear becomes habit, Wanjiru replied. People do not start telling the truth just because the title at the top changed. That was the challenge now. She had power, yes, but power alone did not create trust. In places where silence had been trained for years, authority itself could feel like another threat. So Wanjiru made a decision that surprised even Patel. No formal summons, she said. No intimidating meetings. Bring them one at a time. Neutral room. Tea water, no note-takers in suits unless requested. We listen first. Patel looked mildly skeptical. You believe they will speak? No, she said. I believe some of them want to. That is different. The first person brought in was Mama Achieng, a cleaner in her late 60s, who had worked for Caribou Holdings so long that even the dust in the service hallways seemed to know her footsteps. She entered with hesitant dignity, wearing a neatly washed uniform that had been mended several times at the sleeve. Her hands were rough, her back slightly bent, but her eyes were keen. Wanjiru stood to greet her personally. That alone startled the older woman. Please sit, Wanjiru said. Mama Achieng sat at the edge of the chair as though ready to apologize for occupying it. For the first few minutes she answered only in safe phrases. Yes, madam. No, madam. I only do my work. I do not know much. Management handles those things, the usual survival language. Wanjiru did not press. Instead, she poured tea herself and slid the cup toward her. My mother once cleaned offices too, she said quietly. Mama Achieng looked up. That was the first opening. Wanjiru continued. I know what people think when they see a woman carrying a mop. They think she hears nothing, understands nothing, matters to no one. Something shifted in the older woman's face. Sometimes Mama Achieng said slowly, they speak their true hearts when they think only the floor is listening. Wanjiru did not smile, but warmth entered her eyes. And what have these floors heard? A long silence followed. Then the old cleaner began, not dramatically, not like someone finally relieved to tell a story, more like someone carefully unwrapping dangerous objects from cloth. She spoke of Moses first, how he liked to humiliate staff in public because humiliation spread fear faster than memos, how he targeted people with family burdens because desperation made them easier to control, how he insulted accents, clothes, lateness, hunger, even smell, anything that reminded others, how quickly dignity could be stripped from them. Then she spoke of money. Small deductions, always small, uniform replacement fees charged twice, cleaning supply losses blamed on workers, late arrival penalties even when staff shuttle transport failed, meal voucher reversals that somehow affected only the lowest paid employees. Nobody complains loudly about 100 shillings, Mama Achieng said. That is why they take it in 100s. Wanjiru wrote that sentence down herself. That was not just testimony. That was a system described perfectly. When Mama Achieng left, the second person entered Otieno, the night security guard. Tall, broad, reserved, with the stillness of a man who had seen more than he had ever been paid to mention. He kept glancing at the door until Wanjiru told Ayo to disable the corridor camera feed outside the room for the duration of the interview. Only then did Otieno relax by 1 degree. I saw Moses many times after hours, he said, doing what Wanjiru asked, meeting people who never signed in. Patel's pen stopped. Otieno continued. Mostly supplier representatives, sometimes department staff who should not have needed secret meetings. Once or twice, Mr. Kamau himself? At night, Wanjiru asked. Yes, madam. Service entrance. Basement side. Why not use formal offices? Otieno gave her a look almost sad in its simplicity. Because people who are doing clean things do not sneak them through dirty doors. Again, Wanjiru wrote it down. He described envelopes exchanged, boxes delivered without logging. One occasion when Moses left carrying files from procurement archives that were later returned with pages reordered. Another time when a dismissed contract guard had shouted that he would not take the blame for their theft before being removed and blacklisted by the next week. Why didn't you report it? Patel asked, not accusing, only weary. Otieno looked at him directly. Because I have 3 children, and because men who report powerful men often become examples. No one in the room argued with that. The third witness was Zawadi, the receptionist from the lobby. She entered already trembling. Wanjiru dismissed Patel from the room for her interview. That surprised him, but he obeyed. It turned out to be the right decision. The moment the door shut and only Wanjiru and Ayo remained, Zawadi broke, not in loud sobs. In the quieter way people break after months of swallowing humiliation to keep rent paid. I should have said something that day, she whispered. In the lobby. When he insulted you. Wanjiru shook her head. I am not asking you here to confess cowardice. I am asking you to tell the truth. Zawadi wiped her eyes. The truth is everyone feared him. Not just because he shouted, because he knew things, personal things, who had sick parents, who was on probation, who had loans. He used that knowledge. How he would warn people before they complained, or after. Her voice dropped. He once told me if I continued documenting visitor mistreatment, I would be transferred to a branch so far away I would never see my grandmother again before she died. Wanjiru's jaw tightened. And Kamau? She asked. Zawadi looked stricken. That answer by itself mattered. Speak freely, Wanjiru said. I never saw Mr. Kamau shout, Zawadi said. That was the scary part. He never dirtied his own hands. He would come down, speak softly, call people my daughter or my son. Say he understood their hardship, and then explain why making a complaint at this delicate time would harm the company and put many livelihoods at risk. Wanjiru closed her eyes briefly. Yes, that was exactly the man Mamanjeri had described. Cruelty made administrative, pressure disguised as wisdom. After Zawadi came Kofi, one of the company drivers who had been denied reimbursements for months while being told he lacked proper signatures that, according to him, he had submitted repeatedly. Then a procurement assistant on temporary leave. Then a payroll clerk who arrived pale and sweating, terrified he was being set up. Until Ao proved that Wanjiru already knew enough to protect him if he cooperated. Piece by piece, a pattern hardened. Moses was the visible fist. Kamau was the glove, and around them existed a network of frightened functionaries, some corrupted, some merely broken. All helping the machine move because stopping it seemed more dangerous than feeding it. By afternoon, only one name remained on Wanjiru's list of internal witnesses. Sibusiso, junior finance analyst, excellent academic record, quiet reputation, multiple denied transfer requests, access history touching payroll adjustment chains, and vendor reconciliation layers far above his rank. He entered the room looking like a man walking into either rescue or execution and unsure which awaited him. He was in his early 30s, thin, neatly dressed with exhaustion sitting permanently under his eyes. Sit Sibusiso, Wanjiru said. He sat. His hands were clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. You know why you're here, she said. He nodded once. Then help me save time. He inhaled, exhaled, looked at the table, then at the door. Finally, he said, I have younger sisters. It was such an unexpected answer that even Io looked up sharply. Sibusiso swallowed. Both in school. One asthmatic. My mother had a stroke last year. I am the only salaried person in my house. Wanjiru waited. I am not telling you this for pity, he said quickly. I am telling you because people like Moses and Kamau study men like me. They know exactly how much fear to use. What do they have on you? Wanjiru asked. His mouth tightened. I adjusted numbers. Io's face hardened. Sibusiso lifted his eyes in panic. Not because I wanted to steal. Please understand. At first I thought it was standard reclassification. Then I realized deductions were being rerouted, some supplier overpayments split, and disguised welfare allocations delayed so cash could sit elsewhere first. When I questioned it, Moses laughed and said, I was too intelligent to destroy my whole family over minor processing structures. The room fell silent, and Kamau Wanjiru asked. Sibusiso's gaze flickered. He never threatened me directly, he said. That's not how he works. He called me into his office once and praised my discipline. Then he asked about my sisters by name. Wanjiru felt something icy move down her spine. Sibusiso continued, voice-breaking now. I had never told him their names. There it was, not just corruption, predatory surveillance, power studying vulnerability and using it as a leash. Did you keep anything? Wanjiru asked softly. For the first time, a different expression crossed Sibusiso's face. Not fear, but conflict. Yes, Wanjiru thought. There it is. He knew more, much more, but fear was still fighting conscience inside him, and fear had been fed for too long. I should have come forward earlier, he whispered. Yet you didn't. Wanjiru said. He nodded in shame. Wanjiru leaned forward. "Look at me, Sibusiso." He did. "I cannot promise you that telling the truth will feel safe," she said. "Truth rarely does. But I can promise you this silence will not protect you forever. Men like Moses and Kamau do not keep witnesses. They keep tools until the day the tools become inconvenient." His face changed at that, because he knew it was true. He had probably known it for months, maybe longer. Still he said nothing. Not yes, not no. Just silence heavy with unfinished courage. Wanjiru did not force him further, not yet. She stood signaling the meeting was over. "We are not finished," she said. Sibusiso rose too, looking as though he wanted to speak, but had not yet become the man who could. At the door he stopped. Without turning back, he said, "If they realize you are close, they will strike before you do." Then he left. Io let out a breath. He has evidence. "Yes," Wanjiru said. Patel, who had returned near the end, frowned. "But will he give it?" Wanjiru looked at the closed door for a long moment. Outside, the company continued pretending to function normally. Emails moved, meetings happened. Phones rang, shoes clicked across polished floors. Yet beneath that surface, voices long pushed to the edges had finally begun to speak, and their words were converging toward one unavoidable truth. This was no longer a matter of suspicion. It was a matter of timing, because now Wanjiru had what corrupt systems feared most: witnesses who matched each other. And somewhere inside that fear-bound network, one man was standing on the edge between self-preservation and courage, holding whatever could finally drag the whole rotten structure into the light. The strike came sooner than Sibusiso had warned. By the next morning, Karibu Holdings was no longer merely tense. It was splitting into camps. Wanjiru felt it the moment she stepped onto the executive floor. The greetings were too careful, the smiles too measured. Doors that once opened freely now seemed to close a second faster than usual. Assistants stopped talking when she approached. Even the silence had become organized. Someone had moved during the night. And not defensively. Aggressively. Ayo was waiting in the conference room with a grim expression and 3 printed documents laid side by side like evidence at a crime scene. We had 2 attempted data wipes from mirrored archive folders at 2:13 a.m. and 2:19 a.m., he said. Without preamble. Blocked both. Then this started circulating internally before dawn. He slid the first document toward her. It was an anonymous internal memo formatted to look like a leaked governance concern. The language was polished, strategic, poisonous. It questioned whether the new CEO had acted emotionally and outside procedural standards in suspending a senior manager publicly. It warned of instability caused by leadership theatrics. It suggested that recent irregular audits were less about accountability and more about reputation building by inexperienced leadership seeking quick control. Wanjiru read every line without changing expression. Mr. Patel, who had just entered behind her, muttered, "They're moving fast." No, Wanjiru said softly. They were prepared to move fast. That was worse. It meant Moses and Kamau had not simply panicked. They had contingency language ready, narratives, deflections. They had survived before by controlling not only money, but interpretation. She picked up the second document. This one was uglier. A procedural complaint draft, unsigned, but clearly intended for board circulation, alleging that Wanjiru's undercover visits constituted an abuse of executive authority and possible reputational sabotage. It implied she had manufactured humiliation scenarios to justify a purge. The third document was the most dangerous of all. A packet of altered financial summaries already watermarked for restricted board review. At first glance, it appeared to show unauthorized overrides linked to audit requests issued under Wanjiru's authority. The implication was clear: if this reached undecided board members before she countered it, Kamau could frame her investigation as reckless manipulation. "They're trying to make you the scandal," Patel said. Yes, Wanjiru replied, because they know the actual scandal is real. She set the papers down. For one brief moment, anger flared hot and clean through her. Not because she was surprised, she had expected retaliation, but because the method was so familiar. When powerful people feared exposure, they did not merely deny the truth. They drowned it in counterfeit truth until exhausted bystanders gave up distinguishing between them. That was how injustice survived respectable rooms. Io tapped his laptop. There's more. Kamau has requested an emergency governance review with selected board members at noon. Selected Wanjiru asked. He used the phrase, to prevent destabilizing overreach during a sensitive transition. Patel's jaw hardened. He wants the room before you do. Wanjiru nodded once. Of course he did. A man like Kamau understood something essential about power. The first version of a story, if told in the right room, could wound even when later disproven. Not because it was true, but because suspicion once planted rarely left empty-handed. Who confirmed attendance, she asked. Patel checked his phone. 3 board members already, possibly 5 by noon. Enough to create momentum. Not enough to remove her, perhaps, but enough to stain her authority. Enough to slow her. Enough to buy time for records to disappear, for witnesses to panic, for loyalties to fracture. Wanjiru stood very still. Then she said, Good. Patel blinked. Good, yes, she said. If Kamau wants a room, I'll give him one. But not the one he planned. She turned to Ao. Lock preservation protocols on every flagged archive. Duplicate off-site. Time-stamped. I want chain of custody logs impossible to dispute. Already started. To Patel. Call the full board, not selected members. This is no longer a governance concern. It is a full internal integrity hearing. Patel hesitated. Without complete proof. With enough to justify confrontation, she said, and with enough pressure the rest will reveal itself. That sentence hung between them, because they all knew what she meant. Sibusiso. He was still the missing hinge. Without him, the case against Moses was strong. Against Kamau, it was suggestive, but incomplete. Strong enough morally, maybe not yet strong enough strategically. And Kamau knew it. Wanjiru reached for her phone. Get me Sibusiso. Io dialed first. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Patel's voice lowered. That's not good. No, it was not. Wanjiru called herself this time. The line rang longer, then cut to voicemail. She called again. Off. Her stomach tightened, though her face revealed nothing. Find him, she said. Io was already moving. For the next 40 minutes, the building became a chessboard. Io traced access records and device pings. Patel fought quietly furious calls from board secretaries demanding to know why an internal misunderstanding had escalated into a mandatory hearing. Kamau, meanwhile, moved through the corporate floor with composed gravity, speaking in low tones to department heads building a coalition out of uncertainty. Wanjiru could almost see the method without being present for it. He would not rant. He would not pressure crudely. He would do something far more effective. He would act saddened, concerned, protective of the institution. He would suggest that Moses had indeed behaved badly, but that Wanjiru, young and emotional, had overcorrected in dangerous fashion. He would invite cautious people to imagine scandal, investor panic, shareholder doubt, legal exposure. Men like Kamau built alliances by making cowardice sound responsible. At 10:17 a.m. Io returned. I found Sibusiso's access trail, he said, breathing harder than usual. He badged into the building at 6:48. Basement entry, never badged out. Patel looked sharply up. Where is he now? Io's face tightened. Most likely in one of the old records rooms below procurement. Camera coverage there is partial because of the renovation gap. Wanjiru did not wait for more. Take me. The basement corridors of Caribou Holdings were nothing like the polished executive floors. The air was colder, dustier, threaded with the smell of paper metal shelves and old electrical systems. Here the company stored what it no longer displayed, but still depended on archived files, dead equipment, forgotten furniture, backup records, the physical bones of bureaucracy. Their footsteps echoed as Io led the way. At the far end of a narrow corridor, one records room door stood slightly ajar. Wanjiru pushed it open. Sibusiso was inside. He looked up so fast he nearly dropped the external drive in his hand. His face was grey with fear. Sweat darkened his collar. Open archive boxes surrounded him on the floor, along with printed ledgers, procurement binders, and one small laptop connected to an old docking station. For one heartbeat, nobody spoke. Then Sibusiso said, "I didn't know who else to trust." Wanjiru stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "You disappeared. I know." Why his laugh came out thin and broken. "Because I am a coward." "No," she said. "Cowards run. You came here." That almost undid him. He looked from her to Io to Patel, then back to the drive in his hand, as though it weighed more than metal should. "They know I spoke to you," he said. Patel's expression darkened. "How?" Sibusiso swallowed. "Kamau called me at 7:05. He never calls me directly. He asked why I was in the office so early. He said some files had been misunderstood and that this was my chance to show maturity. Then he asked again about my sisters." Wanjiru felt her anger go very still. That was how fury became most dangerous, when it stopped needing to move. "What's on the drive?" Io asked. Sibusiso held it tighter. "Payroll reroutes, welfare fund diversions. Supplier kickback spreadsheets hidden inside maintenance reconciliation folders. Archive copies of deleted approvals. Voice notes. Moses sent after hours. 3 email chains linking Kamau's office to the reclassification instructions." Patel exhaled sharply. This was it then. The hinge. The bridge between suspicion and proof. But Sibusiso was not done. "There's one more thing," he said. He turned the old laptop toward them and opened a folder labeled with a meaningless code. Inside were scanned files older than the current scheme by many years. Much older. Dismissal records, complaint suppression logs, legacy branch financial discrepancy reviews. Wanjiru stepped closer. Then she saw it. A scanned incident file from the old administrative branch. The year matched the one her mother had described. The names matched, too. And on one internal routing page, half buried among signatures and notations, was Kamau's approval mark. Not as lead decision-maker. As reviewer. As the man who had transformed accusation into procedure. For a second, the room vanished around her. Not physically. Emotionally. Everything narrowed to that page, that name. That proof that the rot beneath Caribou Holdings was not recent opportunism, but an old architecture of harm, one that had once swallowed her mother and then continued feeding on others for years. Sibusiso misread her silence as doubt. "I know the scans are old," he said quickly, "but I checked cross-reference stamps. They're real." He kept copies. "I think as leverage." Wanjiru lifted her eyes slowly. "No," she said. "He kept copies because men like him confuse control with immortality." The hearing was in less than an hour. The old plan to build carefully, gather more, move later died in that basement. This would end today, or at least begin ending. Patel straightened. "We need to secure him," he said. "Meaning Sibusiso?" Io nodded. "I'll duplicate everything now." Sibusiso looked terrified all over again. "If I walk into that room, they'll destroy me." Wanjiru faced him fully. "You were right yesterday," she said. "They were going to strike first." He closed his eyes. "I don't know if I can do this." "Yes, you do," she said quietly. "You just do not know if you can survive it." His eyes opened. "And can I?" Wanjiru did not offer him a false comfort. "I will not lie to you," she said. "They will try to discredit you. They will call you compromised, disloyal, unstable, opportunistic. They will point to every signature they forced from your hand and pretend coercion was consent. His face tightened in pain, because every word was true. Then Wanjiru took one step closer. But today she said they do it in the light. Something changed in him then, not fully. Fear did not leave. Men do not become brave because someone gives a speech. But fear was no longer alone inside him. It had finally been joined by anger, by shame, by exhausted conscience, by the knowledge that the system threatening his sisters had probably destroyed other families long before touching his own. He looked down at the drive one last time. Then he placed it in Wanjiru's hand. At 11:52 a.m., the boardroom doors opened. Inside waited Kamau. Composed and silver-templed, with Moses seated 2 chairs away, looking pale but newly hopeful, and 5 board members arranged in tense expectation around polished wood. Several department heads lined the wall. Legal observers had arrived. 2 governance consultants dialed in remotely. The room smelled of coffee leather and expensive caution. Kamau rose first. "Madam C," he said smoothly. "We were just beginning a discussion about procedural restraint during this unfortunate period of sit down," Wanjiru said. He froze. Not because she shouted, because she did not. She entered with Patel on one side, Ayo on the other, and Sibusiso 2 steps behind them, carrying a slim file and all the terror of a man choosing truth in public. Moses's face changed instantly. Hope collapsed into horror. Kamau saw it too, and for the first time in all their encounters, his calm arrived half a second late. That was enough. Wanjiru placed the drive on the table. Then she looked around the room at the board, at the watchers, at the men who had spent years making cruelty sound procedural. "No," she said, her voice cold and exact. "You are not beginning a discussion." She rested her fingertips on the evidence. "You are about to hear a confession your company has been postponing for years." For one suspended second, nobody in the boardroom moved. The air itself seemed to tighten. Wanjiru stood at the head of the table with one hand resting lightly on the black drive, while Sibusiso remained behind her, pale but upright, clutching a thin file so hard the edges had bent beneath his fingers. Ayo placed his laptop on the polished wood and began connecting it to the boardroom screen. Mr. Patel sat down without a word, his expression already sharpened into legal steel. Across from them, Moses looked like a man who had just seen the earth open beneath his own feet. Kamau recovered faster. Of course he did. Men like him built entire careers on recovering before other people even understood something had gone wrong. He adjusted his cuff, sat back down with controlled elegance, and gave the faintest sigh, as though what stood before him was not danger but inconvenience. "Madame CEO," he said, calm and regretful, "if this is an attempt to turn an internal management disagreement into a public performance, I must advise the board to proceed carefully." Wanjiru did not sit. "This is not a management disagreement," she replied. "It is a corruption hearing." The words landed hard. One of the older board members, Mrs. Okafor, straightened sharply in her chair. Another, Mr. Dlamini, frowned and glanced toward Patel, as if silently asking whether that claim could possibly be justified. The remote governance consultants on the screen stopped typing. Kamau folded his hands. "Strong language," he said, "especially from a CEO who has already chosen theatrical humiliation over process." Wanjiru turned to Ayo. "Play the first file." The screen lit up. At once, a spreadsheet appeared, dense columns, transaction codes, routing categories, staff, welfare entries, procurement adjustments. To most untrained eyes, it looked like the usual chaos of corporate finance. But Ayo had already highlighted the repeating anomalies in red. Wanjiru's voice was even. "These are payroll and welfare diversions from the last 28 months. Small deductions from low-wage staff. Repeated reclassifications of employee support funds. delayed disbursements routed temporarily through maintenance holding lines before partial disappearance. She glanced toward the board. Individually, the amounts were chosen to seem too small for executive scrutiny. Collectively, they formed a theft pattern. Moses shifted violently in his chair. "That is a misreading. Silence," Wanjiru said. He fell quiet at once. Io opened the next layer. Time-stamped authorizations, approval trails, code overlaps linking Moses's departmental accounts to operations reviews signed off through Kamau's chain. Mrs. Okafor leaned forward now, reading. Mr. Dlamini's face lost its neutrality. Kamau, however, remained very still. Too still. "It proves nothing yet," he said. "At most, it suggests administrative irregularities. Large organizations often experience—" "Play the audio," Wanjiru said. The room filled with Moses's voice. Not the polished office voice, the late-night voice. Rawer, coarser, stripped of performance. "Move it through the maintenance line first. If they ask questions, say the staff deductions offset uniform loss and transport failure, and tell that boy in finance not to grow a conscience now Kamau already approved the cover." The recording ended. Silence exploded in its place. Moses's face became slick with sweat. "No," he said instantly. "That can be manipulated. Anyone can edit audio." Io clicked again. A corresponding email chain appeared beside the audio log's timestamp, followed by metadata validation server origin tracing, and a mirrored system archive proving the file had existed in company records before the current investigation began. Patel finally spoke. "For clarity," he said, voice crisp, "all digital evidence shown here has already been duplicated, preserved with chain of custody protocols, and secured for external forensic review if required." That changed the room. Board members who had still hoped this might be containable now understood it had already crossed into a zone where denial could become liability. Kamau saw it too. Wanjiru watched the calculation move behind his eyes. He shifted tactics. "Moses may have acted outside policy," he said with the grave tone of a statesman regretting smaller men's failures. "If so, he should answer for it. But linking isolated misconduct to executive corruption on the basis of frightened junior staff and fragmented files is reckless. We must not let emotional urgency contaminate governance." There it was again. The old language. Not innocence. Containment. Give up the expendable man. Save the system. Moses turned toward him so sharply the chair creaked. For the first time, real betrayal flashed across his face. He had expected protection. Instead, Kamau was already stepping away from him. Wanjiru saw it, and so did everyone else. She turned to Sibusiso. "Tell them." Sibusiso did not move at first. His throat worked once. Twice. The room waited. Then slowly he stepped forward. He looked terrified. He was terrified. That was what gave his words their force. Not confidence, not polish. The shaking honesty of a man with no performance left in him. "My name is Sibusiso Maseko," he said. "Junior Finance Analyst Employee number KH-4471. I processed reclassification requests tied to payroll deductions, support fund delays and supplier overpayment splits under instruction." He swallowed hard. "At first I believed the entries were legitimate adjustments. Later I understood they were concealment." Kamau's expression did not change, but his right index finger tapped once against the armrest. Tiny. Almost invisible. Wanjiru noticed. Sibusiso continued. "When I questioned the pattern, Mr. Moses told me the instructions were protected from above. He named Mr. Kamau directly. After that, I was pressured to continue. My family circumstances were known to them. They used that." Kamau's voice came smooth and cold. "You are admitting participation in fraud." Sibusiso flinched. "Yes," he said. "I am." The room shifted again. Because that answer carried the strange power of truth that no liar likes to use self-implication. He was not pretending innocence. He was confessing weakness. That made him harder to dismiss. They threatened my position, he said. And more than my position. They knew my mother's condition. They knew my sister's names. Mr. Kamau never threatened me directly. He only made it clear that my family's stability depended on my maturity. Mrs. Okafor's eyes snapped toward Kamau. He responded exactly as Wanjiru expected, with sadness. "This is absurd," he murmured. "The boy is frightened and looking for a larger shadow to hide behind. Compassion must not replace evidence." Wanjiru nodded once. "Agreed," she said. "Compassion is not evidence." Then she opened the thin physical file Sibusiso had carried in. "And that is why we also have paper." She removed 3 documents and laid them on the table one by one. Vendor reconciliation printouts with handwritten notation. Legacy approval routing sheets. An archived review page bearing operational sign-off marks. Patel slid copies to the nearest board members. At first they looked merely technical. Then Mrs. Okafor reached the 3rd page and inhaled sharply. Wanjiru did not need to ask why. She already knew the moment had come. "That final document," she said, "comes from an older internal case file. Years before I became CEO. Years before Moses rose to his current position. It concerns a financial discrepancy investigation inside one of our former branch administrative units." Kamau's face changed by almost nothing. But almost was enough. Wanjiru continued. The accusation was redirected toward a low-level female employee with no legal protection, minimal pay, and no meaningful defense. The documentation surrounding the case was deliberately processed to make injustice appear administrative. Mr. Dlamini looked up from the page. "This signature chain," he said slowly. "Yes," Wanjiru replied. "Mr. Kamau was part of that review structure." Kamau leaned back, and for the first time his composure looked deliberate rather than natural. "That file is ancient," he said, "and incomplete. If you intend to weaponize buried legacy paperwork to fuel a personal narrative, then this hearing is no longer professional, it is vindictive. Now." That was the word he had chosen. Vindictive. Not inaccurate, not falsified, vindictive. He was afraid. Wanjiru stepped around the table until she stood directly across from him. "My mother," she said, "was the woman in that file." The boardroom went still in a new way. Not corporate silence. Human silence. The kind that follows a truth suddenly becoming flesh. Moses looked from Wanjiru to Kamau and back again. Horror widening in stages as he realized the ground beneath this hearing was older, deeper, and far more personal than he had ever guessed. Kamau's eyes lifted to hers. At last the courtesy was gone. What stared back at her now was the man beneath the suit, the one her mother had described years ago. Not loud, not crude. Simply convinced that collateral suffering was acceptable so long as the institution remained stable and the right people kept their hands clean. "You should be very careful," he said quietly. "Not to confuse family pain with fiduciary duty." Wanjiru's voice did not rise. "No," she said. "You built your power on the belief that people like my mother would never stand close enough to duty for their pain to matter." She turned to the board. "Let us be clear. This is not a daughter's revenge. If it were, I could have exposed him in the lobby and called it justice. Instead, I audited, preserved, cross-referenced, and brought you evidence." She placed her palm flat on the documents. "What happened to my mother was not an isolated cruelty. It was an early version of the same system we are seeing now. Small thefts from the powerless. Blame redirected downward. Pressure dressed as procedure. Fear used to hold silence in place. Every word landed, not with drama, with finality." Moses suddenly pushed back his chair. "I was not the one who built it," he blurted, his voice cracking. I only followed what was already there. The confession rang through the room before he seemed to realize what he had done. Patel moved first. For the record, he said sharply, "The suspended manager has just admitted participation in an existing corrupt structure." Moses's mouth opened and closed. Kamau turned toward him with something like disgust. That look told Wanjiru everything. Moses had never been a partner, only a useful animal who had now become noisy. "You fool," Kamau said softly. And that was his mistake, because the words were not meant for the board, not meant for law, not meant for procedure. They were private contempt escaping through a crack in the mask. Everyone heard them. Mrs. Okafor set her papers down with deliberate care. "Mr. Kamau," she said, "are you denying involvement in payroll diversion, witness intimidation, supplier manipulation, and historical grievance suppression?" Kamau straightened. "I am denying any criminal intent. Too narrow. Too late." Mr. Dlamini spoke next. "That is not what she asked. No one came to Kamau's rescue. The room had turned. Not morally, perhaps not fully. Boardrooms rarely transform into sanctuaries of virtue. But they had turned enough to smell danger where they once smelled stability, enough to understand that standing too close to Kamau now might stain them permanently. Wanjiru saw it happen in their eyes, calculation changing sides. Good. Let self-interest drag truth the rest of the way if it must. She faced Patel. Effective immediately, she said, "Moses Odhiambo is terminated for gross misconduct, abuse of authority, and participation in organized internal fraud." Moses made a strangled sound. Wanjiru did not look at him. "Mr. Kamau is suspended pending external forensic review and referral to the appropriate authorities for financial misconduct, coercive intimidation, and evidence tampering." Kamau rose halfway. "You cannot." "I can," Wanjiru said. "And I just did." Patel was already signaling security, not the lobby guards. The external compliance team Wanjiru had quietly arranged that morning in case the hearing broke open. 2 officers entered through the side door. Moses looked around wildly as though someone might still save him. No one moved. Then the begging began. "Madame CEO, please," he said, standing so fast his chair nearly toppled. "Please, I have a wife. I have children. I made mistakes, yes, but not alone. Do not destroy my life like this." The room listened. Wanjiru did too. Then she gave him the mercy of truth. "The cleaners whose money you stole had families," she said. "The drivers whose reimbursements you blocked had children. The receptionists you threatened had sick grandparents, school fees, rent, hunger, and fear. You looked straight at struggling people and still chose theft." Moses's eyes filled with panic. "You laughed at poverty." Wanjiru said, "Do not ask poverty for sympathy now." He collapsed back into the chair as if something inside him had been cut. Kamau did not beg. He only stood rigid cold, staring at Wanjiru with the hatred of a man who could tolerate punishment more easily than exposure. That too she understood. To men like him, public loss of narrative was worse than legal risk. The officers stepped forward. The board remained silent. No one defended them. No one called for patience. No one asked for discretion. At last, after years of documents, whispers, deductions, vanished complaints, buried names, frightened workers, and one woman dismissed through a service door long ago, the machinery that had hidden behind professionalism began to crack in public. And as Moses lowered his head and Kamau's mask finally failed, Wanjiru did not feel triumph. Not exactly. What she felt was heavier, cleaner, the first hard weight of justice landing where it should have landed years ago. Justice did not feel loud after the boardroom. It felt administrative. That was the strange part. After years of hidden deductions, buried complaints, coded threats, and polished lies, The fall of Moses and Kamau did not arrive with thunder. It arrived through signatures, access revocations, sealed evidence, envelopes, compliance notices, legal retention orders, and a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on every floor of Caribou Holdings. By late afternoon, the company had entered a different kind of crisis. Not scandal exactly. Exposure. Security officers escorted Moses from the building through a side corridor to avoid spectacle, but spectacle found him anyway. Whispers ran faster than feet. Doors cracked open. Staff who had spent years lowering their eyes now watched openly as the man who had weaponized humiliation walked past them without his badge, without his authority, without the cruel certainty that had once made him seem untouchable. Kamau left separately. That had been Wanjiru's instruction, not as mercy, as method. Moses's downfall was visible enough to satisfy gossip. Kamau's suspension needed to land differently through official notice board alignment and external scrutiny. Men like Kamau survived chaos. What destroyed them was structure finally turned against them. By 6 p.m., a company-wide internal communication had gone out. It did not name every detail. Legal prudence still mattered, but it confirmed leadership suspensions, a formal integrity investigation, and emergency protective measures for employees who wished to report misconduct. It also announced something Caribou Holdings had never truly offered before retaliation protection. The phrase alone shook the building. Wanjiru stood in her office as Nairobi darkened beyond the windows and reread the statement before approving the final version. Mr. Patel stood beside her, tie loosened, now glasses low on his nose, looking more tired than she had yet seen him. "This will trigger panic," he said. "It should," Wanjiru replied. He glanced at her. "Among the guilty, yes, but also among the innocent." Wanjiru nodded slowly. She knew that. In corrupt systems, innocents did not always feel safe when truth finally entered the room. People who had stayed silent to survive often mistook accountability for a storm that would swallow everyone. She would have to act carefully now. Not softly, but carefully. Then tomorrow, she said, we begin separating fear from consequence. That night, she did not go home immediately. Instead, she asked for a list of every employee whose testimony or records had surfaced in the review. Then she marked names by hand. Mama Achieng, Otieno, Zawadi, Kofi, the payroll clerk, the procurement assistant, Sibusiso. There were others too, some already gone from the company, some transferred, some quietly dismissed months or years earlier. Each name represented a life that had bent under pressure while the institution called itself disciplined. Wanjiru stared at the list a long time. This, she thought, was where weak reform usually failed. Companies loved punishing villains when scandal made it unavoidable. They loved symbolic statements, ethics, language, glossy relaunches, culture workshops, new posters on old walls. But the harder work, the moral work, was repair. Not branding. Repair. By morning, she had a plan. The first meeting was not with the board, not with investors, not with the press team. It was with support staff. Word spread quickly that the CEO had requested an all-level gathering in the atrium. Not just managers, not just department heads, but cleaners, receptionists, drivers, guards, clerks, assistants, junior analysts, and anyone else physically present in the building. Some arrived confused, some frightened, some skeptical. A few clearly assumed this was another polished corporate ritual designed to make pain sound solvable. The atrium filled slowly. Wanjiru stood on the low platform without dramatic lighting, without slogans projected behind her, without the performative confidence that executives often borrowed when they wanted to sound human. She waited until the room settled. Then she began. What happened in this company, she said, did not begin yesterday. A ripple moved through the crowd, and it did not survive because two men were uniquely evil. It survived because fear was organized, because small thefts were treated as tolerable if they targeted the powerless, because humiliation became normal, because some people benefited, because some stayed silent, and because this company learned to value order more than dignity. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the air seemed to listen. Wanjiru looked out over them at uniforms, tired faces, guarded expressions, folded arms, lowered eyes, and a few faces already wet with tears they were trying to hide. "I will not insult you," she said, "by pretending trust can be rebuilt with one speech." That reached them. She saw it happen. The skepticism did not disappear, but it shifted, became attention. "So I am not here to ask for trust today," she continued. "I am here to earn the first piece of it." Then she laid out the changes. Immediate reimbursement review for wrongfully deducted wages. Emergency restoration of withheld staff support funds. Independent hotline reporting managed externally. Temporary amnesty review for workers coerced into document manipulation under provable pressure. Mandatory executive-level complaint visibility for all low-wage staff grievances. A protected witness process. Suspension review of all disciplinary actions linked to Moses and Kamau's oversight chain. And one more thing. A new employee dignity charter not drafted by consultants, but co-written over the next month by representatives from every level of the company, including cleaners, drivers, receptionists, security personnel, and clerks. At that, real surprise entered the room, because they understood what she was doing, not merely punishing, redistributing voice. After the gathering, the queue formed almost immediately, not for photographs, not for praise, for disclosure. One woman from facilities wanted to report a supervisor who used overtime threats to demand unpaid extra shifts. A driver wanted his reimbursement records reopened. A junior HR officer wanted to quietly hand over archived complaint summaries she had been instructed to bury. 2 guards asked whether transfer retaliation could now be challenged. A cafeteria worker simply stood before Wanjiru and cried without words until she could finally say, "I thought nobody important would ever listen." That sentence stayed with her all day. By midday, Ao had converted one of the unused training rooms into a temporary response center. Not glamorous, functional. Tables secured laptops, paper forms, water-rotating legal and audit staff. Private interview corners. Wanjiru visited it twice without announcement. Each time it was fuller. Truth, once it no longer had to travel alone, moved quickly, but repair required more than intake. By afternoon she met with finance. Not the compromised line, the cleanest remaining structure Patel and Ao could identify. She sat at the head of a smaller conference table with spreadsheets projected across the wall. "How much can we restore immediately without waiting on litigation recovery?" she asked. The acting controller, a serious woman named Naledi, adjusted her glasses. "If we prioritize employee harm over short-term optics, we can create a provisional relief pool by freezing discretionary executive spending, pausing non-essential office renovation, and suspending 3 vendor contracts currently under review. Do it." Naledi blinked once. "Immediately." "Yes. It will be noticed. It is meant to be." That same afternoon, Wanjiru signed off on a temporary employee relief fund, financed not by public charity theatre, but by internal resource reallocation. The message was intentional. The company would not repair its workers using pity. It would repair them using money that should never have flowed upward, while harm was being hidden below. Then came the most personal meeting of all. She sent a car for Mum and Jerry. Her mother arrived just before sunset, dressed simply as always, wearing a soft brown wrap dress and the same careful dignity she had carried through harder rooms than this. She stepped out of the vehicle slowly and looked up at the headquarters with unreadable eyes. For a moment, Wanjiru simply watched her. The blue glass tower reflected the orange sky. Men in suits moved through the entrance. Staff badges flashed at security gates. To strangers, it looked like power. To the two women standing there, it looked like memory, trying to pretend it had no victims. "You do not have to do this," Wanjiru said quietly. Mamanjeri gave a small smile. "My daughter," she replied. "I survived this place once when it had no reason to be kind. I can walk into it now when it has finally learned shame." Wanjiru almost laughed through the tightness in her chest. They entered together. The lobby fell silent. Not the terrible silence of cruelty this time. A different one. Recognition. The guards straightened. The receptionists stood. Zawadi behind the desk pressed a hand over her heart when she saw Mama and Jerry. No one laughed. No one stared with disdain. People simply made space. It was a small thing, but small things were how harm had once been done here. It was right that small things should begin mending it too. Wanjiru led her mother not through a back corridor, not through service access, not through hidden elevators, but through the center of the atrium and into the executive dining room that had been hastily rearranged for an evening staff acknowledgement gathering. Mamanjeri stopped at the threshold. Silver trays, white tablecloths, soft lights, senior staff standing uncertainly near the walls. Once women like her had cleaned rooms like this and left before the important people arrived. Now every eye turned toward her as a guest of honor, not because she had become rich, because the truth had finally caught up with her dignity. Mr. Patel stepped forward first and bowed his head slightly. "Mamanjeri," he said, "on behalf of those of us who failed to ask enough questions years ago, I am sorry." The room went even quieter. Wanjiru had not instructed him to say that. That mattered. Real change could not be scripted entirely from above. Mamanjeri looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. Not absolution, acknowledgement. Over the next hour, people approached her cautiously. Some knew parts of the old story. Some only knew enough to understand she had once been wronged by the same system now under dismantling. Mama Achieng embraced her. Zawadi cried again. Otieno stood respectfully at a distance until Mamanjeri herself called him closer and thanked him for speaking when it mattered. Wanjiru watched all of it with a strange ache inside her. This was not revenge. Revenge would have been simpler, hotter, shorter. This was harder. It required staying in the room after the guilty fell. It required building something in the ruins. Later, when the guests had thinned and the city lights burned fully outside Wanjiru, and her mother stood alone for a moment in the lobby where the humiliation had begun. The same marble floor, the same reception desk, the same tall doors, but not the same air. Mamanjeri turned slowly, taking it in. "For years," she said, "I thought this place had swallowed my voice." Wanjiru looked at her, and now her mother's eyes softened. Now it has to live with it. They stood hand in hand in the center of the shining floor, not triumphant, not untouched, but upright. Behind them, the company's lights remained on late into the night as audits widened, funds were traced, policies were rewritten, and frightened people discovered that for the first time, speaking might lead somewhere other than punishment. Ahead of them, the work remained enormous. Court processes, restitution, cultural rebuilding, board battles, external scrutiny, perhaps even investor unrest. Wanjiru knew all of it. She also knew this justice that ended in punishment alone would leave the soul of the company untouched. So she made herself one final promise there in the lobby beside her mother. Karibu Holdings would not simply become more careful. It would become different. And if that transformation cost comfort, prestige, and the clean illusion her father's empire once depended on, then so be it. Better an honest scar than a polished infection. 3 months later, Karibu Holdings no longer sounded the same. The change could be heard before it was seen. Voices in the lobby had softened. Guards no longer barked instructions as if every visitor were an inconvenience. Receptionists looked people in the eye instead of over their shoulders. Junior staff walked with less tension in their shoulders. Even the elevators felt different, not because machines cared about justice, but because human beings carried themselves differently inside a building that had stopped rewarding contempt. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. Wanjiru knew better than to confuse progress with purity. There were still investigations underway. 2 supplier contracts had been frozen pending external review. Several dismissals were being legally challenged. A handful of senior managers had resigned to pursue other opportunities, which was corporate language for fleeing before the full stain could reach them. Shareholders had demanded explanations. Journalists had started asking careful questions. Competitors whispered that the company was unstable. And yet, despite all of that, profit had not collapsed. Operations had not disintegrated. Clients had not vanished in panic. The world had not ended because low-level workers were treated like human beings. That, Wanjiru thought, was one of corruption's greatest lies, that dignity was too expensive. On a grey Thursday morning, she stood behind the glass wall of a quiet observation room on the mezzanine level above the atrium and watched the headquarters wake up. Beside her stood Io with a tablet in hand. Mr. Patel stood farther back, arms folded, saying little. Wanjiru was not there today. This morning was not for closure in the emotional sense. It was for proof. On the screen before them, multiple internal camera feeds showed the lobby reception elevator bank and security gate. Wanjiru had arranged the test herself. Not announced, not explained, because transformation, if it was real, had to survive when no one believed they were being examined. At 8:42 a.m., the woman entered. She was not an employee, though only 4 people in the company knew that. She had been brought in discreetly through an outside contact. Wanjiru trusted a young woman named Lerato, a part-time university student with an expressive face, plain sandals, a faded dress, and a second-hand bag with 1 broken zipper. She had been briefed only to enter, ask for the Human Resources office, and behave naturally. No acting, no provocation, just presence. In other words, the same kind of presence that had once triggered cruelty in Moses. Lerato stepped through the front doors, hesitantly blinking once at the brightness of the atrium. She clutched her bag close and paused near the security desk, clearly uncertain where to go. For 1 second, 1 fragile second, Wanjiru felt a pulse of memory so sharp it almost stopped her breath. The torn sandal, the laughter, the bag on the floor. She forced herself to stay still. Below, the nearest guard looked up. He was new to the day shift, a former warehouse officer promoted after internal restructuring. He took in Lerato's clothes, her uncertainty, her obvious nervousness. Then he stood. Not abruptly, not suspiciously, respectfully. He stepped out from behind the desk and said something Wanjiru could not hear through the glass, but she saw the shape of it in his posture. "How may I help you?" Lerato answered, glancing down, then up. The guard pointed toward reception, not dismissing her but guiding her. And before he returned to his post, he opened the small access lane wider for her so she would not have to squeeze awkwardly through the narrow side gap. A tiny act. Tiny. Wanjiru felt her throat tighten anyway. At the reception desk, Zawadi looked up. Months earlier, fear had made her quiet. Now something steadier lived in her. She smiled at Lerato and rose from her chair. Rose. That alone mattered. Too many reception desks were built like walls between the polished and the uncertain. But Zawadi came around the desk, met Lerato halfway, and offered her a chair before asking for her reason for visiting. Lerato sat carefully still, playing no role beyond herself. Zawadi listened, then nodded and picked up the phone. While she waited for an answer, she offered Lerato water. Not because a memo said so, not because a manager watched, because someone had needed water once and been handed humiliation instead. Wanjiru closed her eyes for the briefest second. When she opened them, Patel was watching her, though he said nothing. Below, one of the junior HR officers emerged from the elevator. She was brisk, neatly dressed, and carrying 2 files. For a terrible heartbeat, Wanjiru wondered whether routine stress might erase all the visible tenderness and return the old reflexes. Instead, the woman smiled apologetically, for the delay shook Lorato's hand and asked if she would prefer to speak upstairs or in a quieter interview room closer by. Choice. They were giving her choice. Lorato chose the closer room. The HR officer led her gently, not by grabbing an elbow, not by speaking down to her, but by matching her pace as if nervousness itself were deserving of accommodation. The door closed behind them. Silence filled the observation room. Io let out a slow breath. Patel removed his glasses and cleaned them, though they were not dirty. Wanjiru did not move for a long moment. Then she asked, "Any signs of performance alerts?" Io checked the internal messaging monitor. None. No unusual chatter, no warning chains, no manager broadcasts. This appears genuine. Genuine. The word landed deeper than praise ever could, because that was all she had truly wanted. Not theatre, not reform language, not frightened politeness that would disappear the moment oversight relaxed. Genuine. Still, one test did not make a culture. Wanjiru knew that too well. Second scenario, she said. At 10:06 a.m., another part of the test began. This time, it was a delivery man from an external maintenance vendor arriving with a scheduling error attached to his paperwork, an inconvenience designed to see whether frustration would slide downward into contempt. He was real, not planted, though Io had quietly ensured the situation would be recoverable regardless of outcome. At the loading entrance, a facilities supervisor reviewed the incomplete form, frowned, and then, after a pause, said, "Let's sort it out." No shouting, no accusation, no assumption that lower status meant dishonesty. The supervisor even apologized for the confusion after calling to confirm the correct department routing. Wanjiru watched the interaction twice on replay. The miracle was not sweetness. It was restraint joined to respect, ordinary decency. The most radical thing in buildings once ruled by humiliation. By midday, she had seen enough to believe change had entered the bones of the place, not fully, not irreversibly, but truly. That afternoon, she called a final staff gathering, smaller than the last one, and this time held in the atrium without emergency tension pressing at every word. Employees assembled in clusters, curious but calmer now. They had noticed changes already. Reimbursements had started flowing. Several dismissed workers had received review notices. The anonymous hotline had actually been answered. And perhaps most important of all, no one had yet been punished for speaking. That alone had changed the emotional weather of the company. Wanjiru stepped onto the low platform again. She did not tell them about Lorato. She did not describe the test. Instead, she looked around at faces she now knew better than she wished she had needed to know them, people trained by fear, then slowly retrained by dignity. When I first walked into this building dressed like someone you were expected not to value, she said, this company revealed its sickness quickly. The room remained still. Today, in small ways, it revealed something else. Zawadi lowered her eyes, already understanding more than Wanjiru had said. Otieno stood near, the backhands folded before him. Mama Achieng dabbed at one eye with the corner of her scarf. Wanjiru continued, "Culture is not changed by speeches. It is changed in lobbies, at gates, in late reimbursements, in how supervisors react to mistakes, in whether fear is used as a tool, in whether people with no visible power are treated as though they carry invisible worth." A murmur moved through the crowd. She let it pass. "I am proud of some of what I have seen," she said. "Not because we have finished the work. We have not. But because some of you have started doing what systems rarely teach, and good character always does." Then, with no dramatic pause, she called several names. Zawadi, Otieno, Mama Achieng, Naledi, a junior HR officer named Ruth. the facility's supervisor from the delivery entrance, and finally, Sibusiso. The room shifted at that last name. Sibusiso stepped forward stiffly, still uncomfortable under attention. The months since the hearing had changed him. He was steadier now, though the memory of fear had not left his face entirely. Wanjiru had refused to let the company make him either a symbol of shame or a polished hero. He was what most moral courage actually looked like, late frightened, costly, imperfect, but real. These people, Wanjiru said, did not help rebuild this company because they were flawless. They helped rebuild it because they chose truth service and respect when it would have been easier not to. She handed each of them a formal letter, not a plaque, not a hollow gift basket. Letters confirming promotion review, salary correction, restitution, or formal commendation tied to actual structural advancement. Recognition that changed material life, the kind that meant something. Mama Achieng opened hers with trembling fingers and had to sit down when she realized it included retirement protection and back pay correction for years of unjust deductions. Otieno's letter confirmed supervisory elevation and housing support. Zawadi's included a leadership track offer for front office operations. Ruth received oversight authority and employee intake reform. The facility's supervisor was brought into service, standards redesign. And Saibusaiso, his letter was the hardest for the room to understand, and the most important for Wanjiru to give. It was not unconditional absolution. It was conditional restoration, a continued role under protected review, ethics retraining, and supervised advancement into internal audit support if he completed the full process honorably. Not because he deserved easy redemption, because systems that wanted truth in the future needed to teach people that confession could lead to responsibility, not only ruin. After the gathering, as staff slowly drifted back toward their departments, Wanjiru remained in the atrium. Sunlight angled through the glass and spread across the marble floor in long, pale bands. The reception desk gleamed softly. Shoes crossed the lobby. Phones rang. Somewhere above, printers hummed. The building lived. Mama Nyeri arrived quietly a little later, as she sometimes did now. Not often, not possessively, but freely. Freely. That mattered. Wanjiru saw her standing near the entrance and walked to meet her. "What did I miss?" her mother asked. "A test," Wanjiru said. And Wanjiru looked around the lobby. A visitor was being helped by reception. A security guard carried a parcel for an elderly supplier who seemed confused by the check-in system. Two junior staff members paused to greet Mama Achieng by name, not title, not duty. Then Wanjiru smiled. It was not the cold smile of victory, not the hard smile of justice delivered. Something softer, rarer, hope with evidence. "They passed," she said. Mama Njeri followed her gaze and understood. For a long moment the two women stood side by side in the same place where humiliation had once been poured across marble like spilled water. Now the air held something else. Not perfection, not innocence, but proof that cruelty was not destiny. Wanjiru took her mother's hand, and together they walked slowly through the center of the atrium, past the reception desk beneath the bright, open ceiling, toward the glass doors where mourning had once turned into shame. This time, no one laughed. No one looked away in cowardice. No one needed to know history to feel its reversal. Because some endings did not arrive in explosions. Some arrived when a building that once taught people to shrink finally learned to make room. After everything that happened, one truth remained clearer than wealth, title, or power. The way people treat those who seem powerless reveals the deepest truth about their character. It is easy to speak about integrity in boardrooms, easy to print values on walls, easy to act kind when someone is important. But real morality appears in smaller moments, in how we respond to the poor, the nervous, the unimportant, the tired, the late, the broken, the unseen. Wanjiru's story was never only about exposing a bully or punishing corrupt men. It was about something deeper, the responsibility that comes with seeing wrong and refusing to dress it up as procedure. Her father left her a company but also a moral debt. And true healing began only when she chose not merely to defeat the guilty, but to restore dignity to the wounded. That is what justice becomes at its highest level, not revenge, but repair with truth at the center. Many people stay silent because they are afraid. Sometimes that silence comes from weakness, sometimes from survival. But silence, if left unchallenged, becomes shelter for cruelty. The courage to tell the truth may come late, trembling, and imperfect like Sibusiso's did. Yet even imperfect courage can break a system that has survived for years on fear. In the end, healing did not come because powerful people suddenly became good. It came because one woman chose to look directly at what others had hidden. One mother refused to let pain poison her soul, and a few ordinary workers dared to stand upright when it mattered most. So remember this: never measure a human being by what they wear, what they own, or how quietly they stand in front of you. Some of the strongest people carry their dignity in silence, and sometimes the person the world is quickest to dismiss is the very person sent to reveal who everyone truly is. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments, would you have spoken up in that lobby, or would fear have kept you silent? And where are you watching from today? Drop your country and local time. I always love seeing where this community is joining from. If you enjoy powerful emotional stories about justice, healing, and life-changing truth, subscribe and stay with me for more.